The history of violent crime is often recorded in ballistics reports, autopsy files, and interrogation transcripts. But sometimes the most harrowing evidence isn't locked away in an evidence locker. Sometimes it is left out in the open, displayed for the entire world to see, disguised as something beautiful. For 37 years, the residents of Oakhaven, Oregon, walked past the municipal library every single day. They walked past the sprawling, 20-foot mural on its western wall, a depiction of the town's founding fathers gazing out over a pristine valley. They looked at the brushstrokes. They looked at the vibrant blues of the painted sky and the emerald greens of the tree line, and they thought they were looking at art. They didn't realize they were looking at a crime scene. To understand the horror of what happened in Oakhaven, we must first understand the silence that fell over the town on October 14, 1987. This was not the silence of peace. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a question that had been screamed into a void with no echo ever returning. The question was, where is Alara Vance? In 1987, Oakhaven was the kind of place that prided itself on safety. It was an era of analog trust. Front doors were left unlocked until the streetlights hummed to life. Children rode their bicycles to the edge of the quarry without supervision. Communication was tethered to the wall by a coiled cord. If you weren't home to answer the phone, you were simply unreachable. In this world of disconnection, disappearing was difficult, yet paradoxically staying lost was easy. Alara Vance was 24 years old. By all accounts, she was a woman possessing a luminosity that made her impossible to ignore. Friends described her not just as an artist, but as a chronicler of life. She carried a bulky Canon A1 camera everywhere she went, capturing the mundane textures of the town, the rust on a vintage truck, the way light hit the diner windows at sunset. But her true passion was painting. When the town council commissioned a mural to revitalize the aging brick exterior of the public library, Alara was the unanimous choice. It was to be her magnum opus, a project that would launch her career far beyond the claustrophobic borders of Oakhaven. She called the piece The Horizon of Tomorrow. October 14th began as a Tuesday like any other. The meteorological records for the county indicate a sharp drop in temperature, the kind of crisp, biting autumn air that signals the coming of winter. Witnesses placed Alara at the library wall at 8 a.m. sharp. She was wearing her signature oversized denim jacket, stained with a constellation of acrylics and oils, and her hair was tied back in a messy knot. She had set up her scaffolding the week prior, a metal skeleton climbing 20 feet up the brickwork. Mr. Henderson, the town librarian, was the last person to have a verified interaction with her. In his statement to the police recorded 3 days later, he recalled bringing her a thermos of black coffee at approximately 10:30 a.m. He noted that Alara seemed feverish, not sick, but possessed by a frantic, nervous energy. She was working on the upper left quadrant of the mural, painting the storm clouds that were meant to loom over the valley in the depiction. Henderson told police that Alara kept looking over her shoulder, scanning the parking lot and the tree line of the adjacent park. When he asked her if she was all right, she reportedly replied, "The light is changing too fast. I have to finish the sky before the light changes." It was a cryptic comment, dismissed at the time as the eccentricity of an artist. In hindsight, it reads like a frantic plea. At 12:15 p.m., a delivery driver for a local bakery dropped off supplies at the library's rear entrance. He told investigators he saw Alara on the scaffolding. She wasn't painting. That's odd. She was standing perfectly still, her brush hovering inches from the wall, staring intently at a dark sedan parked across the street. The driver couldn't make out the make or model, only that it was dark, domestic and idling. This vehicle would become a phantom in the case files, seen by 3 different people, described differently by each, and never located. By 4 p.m., the autumn sun began its descent, casting long, bruised shadows across the town square. Mrs. Gable, a schoolteacher walking her dog, passed the library. She later testified that the scaffolding was empty. But this wasn't unusual. Alara often took breaks to stretch or walk to the corner store. But Mrs. Gable noticed something else, however, and then the bucket of sky blue paint on the highest platform had been kicked over. A distinct rivulet of cerulean blue was dripping down the scaffolding, pooling on the concrete below like synthetic blood. Ilara's 1981 Honda Civic was still parked in the library lot. Her purse was locked inside. Her keys were in the ignition. Her camera, her most prized possession, was missing. The panic didn't set in immediately. In 1987, you gave people time. You assumed they ran into a friend, or their car broke down, or they decided to catch a late movie in the next town over. It wasn't until 9 p.m. when Ilara failed to return home to the small apartment she shared with her younger sister, Tess, that the first thread of dread was pulled. Tess Vance called the station at 9:45 p.m. The desk sergeant told her to wait 24 hours. Tess didn't wait. She drove to the library, and the scene she found would haunt the case file for decades. And the streetlights buzzed overhead, illuminating the half-finished mural. And the faces of the town founders were completed, staring stoically out at the empty parking lot. But the sky, the section Ilara had been frantically working on, was a chaotic mess of dark grays and blues, heavy strokes that looked less like clouds and more like bruises. Tess climbed the scaffolding, screaming her sister's name. On the platform, she found a single sneaker, Ilara's white Reebok, left tied. There was no struggle, no blood, no sign of a fight. Just the shoe, the spilled paint, and a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. The investigation that followed was a masterclass in frustration. The Oakhaven Police Department was ill-equipped for a disappearance of this magnitude. They treated it initially as a runaway case. Artist skips town, the local papers speculated. They theorized she had cracked under the pressure of the commission and fled to California or New York. But those who knew Ilara knew she would never leave her art unfinished. Weeks turned into months. The dark sedan lead went nowhere. A local man, a drifter who worked odd jobs at the lumber yard, was brought in for questioning because he had been seen watching Ilara paint days prior. He was held for 48 hours, interrogated until he wept. But his alibi held up. He was at a clinic in the neighboring county getting stitches for a work injury at the exact time of the disappearance. The town began to turn on itself. Rumors festered. Was it a lover's quarrel? Did Ilara see something she shouldn't have? The investigation revealed that Ilara had been receiving hang-up calls for weeks prior to the 14th. Trace records from the phone company showed the calls came from a payphone at a gas station on the edge of town, a station that had been closed for repairs that entire month. Who breaks into a closed gas station just to breathe silence into a phone receiver? As the one-year anniversary approached, the case went cold. And the missing posters, once taped to every telephone pole and shop window, began to fade, sun-bleached and tattered. The town council, uncomfortable with the constant reminder of the tragedy, debated painting over the mural. Tess Vance fought them with a ferocity born of grief. She chained herself to the scaffolding in a protest that made state news. The council relented. They hired a different artist to seal the work, applying a clear protective coat to preserve Ilara's last creation, unfinished sky and all. The mural became a macabre landmark, a memorial. Locals avoided looking directly at the chaotic, stormy sky Ilara had painted in her final hours. They said it gave them a bad feeling. They said the clouds looked like they were moving. 37 years passed, and the world changed. The library introduced computers, then internet terminals, then Wi-Fi. And the payphones vanished. The cars in the parking lot became sleek and silent. Oakhaven expanded, swallowing the surrounding woods with subdivisions. Most of the officers who worked the Vance case retired or passed away. Tess Vance, now a woman in her 60s, never stopped looking, but her hope had hardened into a brittle, painful resolve. Then came the storm of 2024. It was a nor'easter of historic proportions, a bomb cyclone that battered the Oregon coast and sent torrential rains sweeping inland. For 3 days, Oakhaven was hammered by wind and water. Trees that had stood for a century were uprooted, roofs were shorn off, and the municipal library, standing exposed on the hill, took the brunt of the weather. The wind was so fierce it acted like a sandblaster. It stripped away the siding of the adjacent hardware store. And on the western wall of the library, the relentless, driving rain, mixed with hail and debris, began to attack the mural. The clear protective coat, applied in 1988, failed first. Then, the cheap restoration paint used by the town over the years to touch up the mural began to dissolve. It happened on the morning of the fourth day, when the sun finally broke through the slate-gray clouds. A maintenance worker, tasked with assessing the storm damage, walked around the perimeter of the library. He stopped dead in his tracks. The mural was ruined. The faces of the town founders were streaked and melting. But it was the upper left quadrant Ilara's sky that stopped his heart. The chaotic, dark storm clouds Ilara had painted in her final frantic hours had been washed away. It turned out the dark paint was water-soluble, a different mixture than the oil-based primer she had used for the rest of the piece. Or perhaps she had intentionally used a paint she knew wouldn't last forever. Underneath the layer of dark, bruised clouds, the rain had revealed what was there first. The maintenance worker called the police. And this time they didn't treat it as a prank. The chief of police arrived, followed shortly by a forensic team. They taped off the area, not because of a body, but because of what was written on the wall. Hidden beneath the paint, perfectly preserved for nearly 4 decades, was not a picture. It was text. Ilara hadn't been painting clouds because she was inspired. She had been painting them to hide something. She had been covering up a message she had painted directly onto the brick, concealing it until the time was right or until nature intervened. The letters were 4 feet tall, painted in stark, jarring red. They were frantic, slightly uneven, as if done in a rush before the clouds were layered over them to hide the secret from her killer, who she must have known was watching. And the message read. The silence of 1987 was broken. The hymn in the message was unknown. There were no missing men in Oakhaven in 1987. But the second sentence, "Ask the Mayor," sent a shockwave through the community that shattered 37 years of complacency. The mayor in 1987 was a man named Arthur Sterling, the beloved pillar of the community, a man who had delivered the eulogy at Ilara's empty casket funeral, a man who had died of a heart attack in 1999, taking his secrets to the grave. Or so he thought. Mine. As the police stared up at the wall, and the news vans began to circle like vultures, one thing became terrifyingly clear. Ilara Vance didn't just vanish. She was erased because she saw something. That she saw a shoe that belonged to someone who wasn't supposed to be there. And she knew that her art was the only safe box she had left. She painted her confession. Then she painted over it, leaving a time bomb in pigment and oil. But the message on the wall was only the beginning. Because as the forensic team began to photograph the red lettering, the forensic light caught something else. Embedded in the red paint, visible only now that the top layer was washed away, was a small physical object stuck into the mortar between the bricks. The revelation on the library wall did not just open a cold case. It ripped the scab off a wound the town of Oakhaven didn't know was festering. The red letters, bleeding against the brick in the damp Oregon air, transformed the mural from a memorial into an accusation. They buried him under the foundation. Ask the mayor why I saw the shoe. The Oakhaven Police Department, now led by Chief Miller, a man who was only a rookie when Ilara vanished, locked down the scene with a ferocity that bordered on paranoia. The media trucks arrived by dawn, their satellite dishes turning the quiet library parking lot into a broadcast center. But while the pundits speculated on the identity of the mayor, a title held by the late Arthur Sterling for 20 years, the investigation turned its focus to the physical evidence Ilara had left behind, the brass key, number 114. In 1987, Oakhaven had 3 banks. By 2024, only one remained, absorbed into a national conglomerate. However, the key didn't fit any modern lock. It was a relic of the Oakhaven First National, a bank that had shuttered its doors in the economic downturn of the mid-90s. Its assets and its safe deposit boxes had been transferred to a storage facility in the state capital, a graveyard of forgotten deeds and unclaimed heirlooms. Chief Miller and a team of forensic auditors drove 3 hours to the facility. The legal hurdles to open a box registered to a Jane Doe. Elara had rented it under a pseudonym, E.V. Artist, took 48 hours to clear. The tension was palpable. The box, number 114, was a narrow steel drawer, gathering dust in a climate-controlled vault. When they slid the drawer open, the air inside smelled of stale paper and time. There were no diamonds, no cash, no confessions written in blood. There were only two items. The first was a receipt from Don's camera darkroom, dated October 12, 1987, 2 days before Elara vanished. It was for the purchase of high-speed black-and-white film. The second item was the roll of film itself, and a canister of Kodak Tri-X 400, exposed, the leader wound tight inside the casing. Elara hadn't trusted the mail. She hadn't trusted her apartment. She had locked the evidence in a steel box and painted the map to its location on the only canvas she knew the town wouldn't destroy. The development of 37-year-old latent images is a delicate, chemical tightrope walk. The film was rushed to a specialist lab in Portland. The gelatin emulsion could have cracked. The latent image centers could have faded into a fog of gray noise. For 6 hours, the town of Oakhaven held its breath. Tess Vance, now a grandmother, sat in the waiting room of the police station, staring at the floor, terrifyingly close to the answers she had spent a lifetime begging for. And the digital scans of the negatives arrived at 8 p.m. The first 10 frames were innocuous test shots of the library wall, light studies, a stray cat near the scaffolding. They were the eyes of an artist looking for texture. Frame 11 changed everything. It was taken from a high vantage point, likely from the top of the scaffolding where Elara spent her days. It was a telephoto shot, grainy but sharp enough to distinguish faces. The image showed a construction site. In 1987, Mayor Arthur Sterling had been championing the beautification project, which included a new gazebo and fountain in the center of the town square, just 2 blocks from the library. Frame 11 showed Mayor Sterling standing by the edge of the pit dug for the fountain's foundation. He wasn't alone. He was arguing with a man in a rumpled suit. The man was holding a thick file folder. Frame 12 caught the moment of violence. It was a blur of motion. The mayor was swinging something, a shovel. A heavy pipe. The man in the suit was falling backward, his arms flailing. Frame 13 was the shoe. The man was lying in the wet concrete at the bottom of the foundation pit. The angle was steep. The victim's leg was twisted unnaturally, and one loafer, a distinct, tasseled leather shoe, had come loose, resting on the lip of the concrete form. Mayor Sterling was looking down at it. Frame 14 was the most chilling. It wasn't of the crime. The camera had panned. It was a shot of the mayor's driver, a man leaning against a dark sedan. The dark sedan, witnesses had reported, and the driver was looking up. He was looking directly at the library scaffolding. He was looking directly at the lens. He had seen her. Elara didn't just see a shoe. She photographed a murder. The victim in the photos was quickly identified by cold case historians. In September 1987, a state auditor named Julian Halloway had been dispatched to Oakhaven to investigate discrepancies in the municipal bond funds controlled by Mayor Sterling. Halloway had vanished on October 12th. His car was found at a bus station in the next county. The police at the time, under Sterling's thumb, ruled it a voluntary disappearance, citing Halloway's gambling debts. The truth was far simpler and far darker. Halloway had found the stolen money. Sterling had silenced him, and Elara Vance, seeking the perfect light for her clouds, had witnessed the burial from her perch in the sky. The excavation of the Oakhaven Town Square fountain began the next morning. It was a spectacle of jackhammers and heavy machinery. In the fountain, a beloved centerpiece where children had tossed pennies for wishes for 3 decades, was torn apart. Beneath 4 feet of concrete, encased in the limestone foundation, the forensic anthropologists found him. Julian Halloway's skeletal remains were preserved in the cement tomb, the file folder of evidence still tucked into his jacket pocket, though the papers had long since disintegrated into pulp. And they found the shoe. The tasseled loafer, knocked loose in the struggle, trapped in the masonry like a fossil. The town reeled. The legacy of Arthur Sterling, the statues, the park names, the scholarships collapsed overnight. And his family, those who remained, went into hiding. But for Tess Vance, the discovery of Julian Halloway was only a prologue. The question remained, where was Ilara? The photos proved Ilara had been spotted. The driver seen in frame 14 was identified as Frankie Miller, no relation to the chief, a known enforcer for organized crime elements in the city, who had been on Sterling's payroll as a security consultant. Frankie had died in a prison riot in 2005. The police theorized that Frankie had come for Ilara at the library on October 14th. He had waited until the area was clear. But Ilara was smart. She knew they were coming, and that was why she painted the message. And that was why she hid the key. She knew she wasn't making it out of Oakhaven. The final clue lay not in the ground, but in the film roll. There were 24 exposures on the roll. The police had focused on the murder sequence in the middle. But the final frame, number 24, had been initially dismissed as a mistake, a blur of light and shadow, underexposed and frantic. Digital enhancement experts from the FBI were brought in to analyze frame 24. They adjusted the contrast, pulled detail from the shadows and sharpened the grain. The image that emerged was not a mistake. It was a desperate final act of documentation. And it was taken inside a car, the interior of a 1980s vehicle. The camera was evidently sitting on the floorboard, the shutter triggered perhaps by accident, or perhaps by a surreptitious press of a finger. The angle was low, looking up. It showed the dashboard of a car. Hanging from the rearview mirror was a distinctive air freshener, a pine tree shape, and through the windshield, blurred by motion, was a road sign. It wasn't a highway sign. It was a private road marker, Blackwater Ridge. The Blackwater Ridge was a dense, forested area 10 miles north of town. In the 1980s, it was the site of an abandoned quarry, a place where teenagers went to drink and where stolen cars were torched. Chief Miller led the convoy to the ridge. The quarry had been filled in years ago, turned into a nature preserve. But the old access road remained, overgrown with brambles and poison ivy. They brought cadaver dogs. For 2 days, the dogs searched the dense undergrowth. They found rusted beer cans, old tires, and the chassis of a truck from the 70s. On the 3rd day, a dog named Buster sat down near a cluster of ancient oak trees at the edge of the old quarry drop-off. He didn't bark. He just whined a low, mournful sound. The team began to dig. The earth here was soft, a mixture of loam and clay. 3 feet down, the spade hit something metallic. It wasn't a body. It was a camera lens. They unearthed the Canon A1 first. It was corroded, the glass shattered, the strap rotted away. It had been buried separately, perhaps as a final insult to the artist. Beneath the camera, wrapped in a heavy tarp that had miraculously withstood the decades better than the body it held, was Ilara Vance. She was still wearing her denim jacket, the one stained with the paint of the mural. In her pocket, preserved in a plastic bag she must have used to keep her brushes wet, was a folded piece of paper. The moisture had seeped in, but the ink was oil-based. It was a letter. Not to the police, not to the town, but to Tess. Tess, I saw them. The man in the suit. The mayor. They saw me. I'm going to hide the film. If I don't come home, check the wall. I love you. Don't let them paint over the sky. The funeral for Ilara Vance was held on a Tuesday, 37 years and 2 weeks after she disappeared. The entire town of Oakhaven attended. They stood in the rain, a sea of black umbrellas. They buried her not in the cemetery, but in a new plot dedicated in the town square, right where the fountain used to be. The mural on the library wall was never restored. The town council voted to leave it exactly as the storm had left it. The faces of the corrupt founders melted away. The red message of accusation faded but visible, even the raw brick showing through. But the most haunting detail wasn't the funeral, or the conviction of the mayor's co-conspirators who were still alive. It was the final revelation from the autopsy. The coroner found that Ilara hadn't died immediately. She had been taken to the woods, likely interrogated about the film. She had refused to talk. The cause of death was blunt force trauma, consistent with a fall, and they had pushed her into the quarry. But under her fingernails, embedded deep in the nail beds, was red clay and brick dust. Oh, the timeline didn't match. If she was taken from the library at 4 p.m., she couldn't have brick dust under her nails from the quarry. Unless, the investigators went back to the library wall. They looked at the message again. They buried him under the foundation. They looked at the letters. They were 4 feet tall, painted in red. Lisa, the forensic analysis of the paint under Ilara's fingernails came back. It wasn't just brick dust. It was red pigment. Ilara hadn't painted the message with a brush. In those final, frantic moments on the scaffolding, knowing the car was waiting, knowing she had minutes before they came up to get her, she hadn't wasted time with brushes. She had dipped her hands into the raw pigment. She had clawed the message onto the wall with her bare fingers, screaming her testimony in silence before the darkness took her. The storm had washed away the clouds to reveal the truth, but it was Ilara's own hands that had carved the justice of Oakhaven. The case was closed. The files were boxed. But every time it rains in Oakhaven, when the sky turns that specific, bruised shade of purple-gray, the locals look at the library wall. They don't see a crime scene anymore. They see a testament. They see a testament. Some say that if you stand there long enough, you can still smell the turpentine. Others say that when the wind blows through the new trees in the square, it sounds like the shutter of a camera, clicking once, forever capturing the sins of the past.